If you've already heard of Razion Ex, it may be less for what it offers purely as a shmup, and more due to the little controversy that was stirred up when shmup fans, physical collectors and scalpers all butted heads last year over its physical and subsequent digital releases. It was in all honesty a bit of a storm in a teacup, but it did raise the game's profile, and even today there are chancers on eBay looking for a good couple of $100 for this thing. The natural question then is it worth it? And not so much in the purely monetary sense, but in terms of the attention that it's been receiving, and the answer is yes and no. Razion Ex is, especially for a new game, a pretty quality little arcade style shmup that does a good job of aping its Neo Geo era inspirations. It's also, however, riddled with what I consider to be kind of schoolboy errors that, while they're mostly relatively minor, do build up to leave this in need of a little polishing before being considered something worthy of the elevated profile it was granted last year. The mechanics of the game are simple. You have a forward shot with an almost but not quite cave style focus and rapid shot. And you have a rechargeable beam cannon in place of a bomb. The beam cannon can be fired as many times as you like. This beam does solid damage, but there's a trade-off in that immediately after firing, your regular shots become slightly less powerful for a short period. And it's right here with the main mechanics that we see the first of these odd schoolboy errors creeping in. For one, the visual distinction between your two shot types is minimal, and while there is a difference when you're in the cooldown period, I only noticed it after having it pointed out. There's also to me a very odd thing going on with your two shot types. Now, this may depend on your individual playstyle, but for me, whenever I play games with the focus rapid shot mechanic, I tend to hold down the rapid shot at all times and tap the focus button at the same time when using that shot. Holding down both buttons like this, in my experience, literally always causes the focus shot to take precedence, and it's something that I have got 100% used to. But in Razion Ex, this doesn't happen. Instead, it is the rapid shot that fires when you hold both buttons, and while this may not even be an issue at all to some people, personally I found it really weird and really hard to get used to, with a feeling akin to finding yourself behind the wheel of a car in one of those mad countries who drive on the right. This issue aside though, the game controls well, and your power level is satisfying. Enemies are numerous, and if you let them will quickly fill the screen with bullets, although things rarely if ever reach Danmaku levels of density. There are a lot of narrow passages in the game with enemies crawling along the floor or hanging from the ceiling, but your ship mercifully does not explode on impact with the walls, and very usefully can shoot its beam through the overhangs that sometimes block your sight of certain enemies. Popcorn formations are well interspersed with medium, large and even mid-boss style enemies, including the excellent Terminator style mid-boss, and the game keeps up a pretty relentless pace across the majority of its 6 stages. In many ways, in fact, I would say the game plays more like a manic vertical shmup turned on its side, with few of the tropes commonly associated with horizontal shmups, something that I personally consider absolutely a positive. And if the game was just what's being described so far, it would be a solid enough old school affair, but it also includes an interesting, although to me very tricky to optimise scoring system based around collecting points cubes. Now, it is more complicated than what I'm about to describe, but the gist of it is that defeated enemies drop yellow points cubes which will be sucked towards your ship if you're close enough to them. These cubes both give you points, naturally, and recharge your beam cannon faster. However, they don't last forever, and if you don't get them quickly enough they will break and disappear. Since you don't want this, what you can do is shoot them with your beam cannon to freeze them, at which point they will turn a kind of greeny blue. These green cubes are then worth more and charge your cannon even faster, but they will still eventually unfreeze and break if you leave them too long. The concept so far isn't too revolutionary, but there are a couple of further interesting little spins on things that add a lot more strategy to proceedings. See, collecting the cubes builds a counter, but allowing even one to break ends that counter and breaks all cubes on screen, meaning you really want to make sure you are getting them all, except that you also get rewarded more based on how many cubes are on screen at once, creating a difficult to judge balancing act where you want to keep the cubes floating about for as long as possible, while also making sure none of them break and disappear, and your best way of doing this is to freeze and refreeze the cubes with your beam cannon, a weapon you can use more frequently, by collecting those very same cubes. I'll be honest, while I understand the system in principle, I have not fully worked out how to make optimal use of it in-game, but I have seen enough people hitting big scores from even single stages to know there is clearly a lot more to exploit than I've been able to achieve so far myself. A further scoring trick relates to the bosses, who will give a pretty juicy bonus if defeated without using your beam shot. This adds another interesting flavour to scoring, as many of them are not too hard with liberal beam use, but offer far greater challenge without it, and the reward when achieved feels very merited. It's a shame then that the bosses are another area where the game makes one of its odd missteps. Not that the battles and patterns are anything less than highly engaging, nor that the bosses themselves are unimaginative in appearance. Quite the opposite, in fact. Some of them look very cool indeed, although again some of them do seem like they'd be more suited to a vertical game. The problem is more with the way they arrive and depart, with almost every one just drifting in from the right, and then retreating the same way when bested in the same anticlimactic departure almost every single time. There are some minor explosive effects, but victory is marked more by some decidedly underwhelming fanfare playing, and I found the end of the fights in particular to be far less satisfying than the usual violent blast and eruption into smithereens. That said, they do look good and they fit well with the game's aesthetic, an aesthetic which is very distinct, with a readily identifiable palette that imbues the whole game with a clear and unique atmosphere. The game starts with one of its best visual sequences as you fly first over and then into a space station, some giant ship roaring past in the background. Further stages take place in caves and watery underground caverns before depositing you back out into the blackness of space. But one downside of the game having its own very distinct aesthetic is that despite each stage taking place in a different location, the similar use of colour leaves the stages feeling less distinct from one another than a verbal description would suggest they should be. And while enemy and background visuals are all executed very well, a further obvious and really kind of basic error is with the enemy shots, which, while distinct enough on their own, often get covered up by player shots, explosions, foreground elements, and pretty much everything, when you would think the opposite should be the case, with enemy shots always being the most important thing to keep visible. There's also a very odd visual effect in stage 5, where asteroids, which are poorly delineated in the first place, flash orange when shot, as if to indicate that they're taking damage, but in reality can't actually be destroyed at all. In terms of the options and extras, the game does enough without providing anything extensive. There is both a stage and boss select, but there are no other modes of play. There are 3 difficulties, each of which offers a different ship, instead of ships being selected by the player. Scores are local only and rather oddly accessed through an option labelled Achievements in the menu. Finally, there are some decent scanline options, and this is a game that really does look significantly better with them turned on. All in all, at its core, Razion Ex is a very decent game that impressively mimics the older shmups it's taken as its inspiration, while also adding an intriguing scoring system alongside enough modern twists to keep it feeling fresh and give it its own identity. Like all games, there are imperfections, but the ones here feel more odd than just simple minor inconveniences, and give a somewhat rough around the edges impression to an otherwise fun and exhilarating experience. I would give it an 8 out of 10, and while I wouldn't ever pay $200 for it, I'm very happy to have landed a physical copy, not just from a collector's standpoint, but because the game itself is definitely well worth owning, and I very much look forward to seeing how NG's dev team's next effort, Gunvein, turns out when it arrives, hopefully later this year. I know a lot of people had trouble ordering this, but with it having been made available digitally, hopefully more of you will have had the chance to play it, so do let us know your own thoughts below, and thanks as ever for watching. See you next time. Cheers.